And thanks again for coming out. I'm glad to see this book because, you know, there have been a few books and things dealing with the topic of, say, what we might call the politics of gaming. However, I think for the most part, they tend to either focus on the culture of gaming or maybe on the content of games and sort of critical analysis of the content, psychology, reception theory, all that type of stuff, which is important. However, I haven't really seen anything that really addresses the political economy of gaming and actually the lives of the workers who produce the games and what that means. I think for perhaps by nature of the medium, people tend to look at games in a very surface level and they kind of don't analyze these aspects of it. So I'm really glad to have someone who is equipped to do that on the editorial board of Historical Materialism. So I think that's pretty good background for someone doing something on political economy. And I would like us to welcome Jamie Woodcock.
Thank you very much. So what I want to talk about today is, unsurprisingly, I'm going to talk about the book. But I wanted to start by giving you some of the reasons why I wrote this kind of book. And in part, I thought it would mean I'd get to play more video games. Didn't exactly work out that way. But it was also about thinking through, for me, something that I grew up around. So my dad is a computer scientist. So from quite an early age, there were video games in our house. And so I kind of feel like this is a medium that I grew up around. I remember, when you think back to those early childhood memories, you have the ones where you're shown photos and you remember them and so on. The ones I really remember are being given floppy disks, some of them with the original game packaging, some of them wrapped up in paper with marker pens written on them. I'm sure they weren't copied without authorization, but handed to my dad by one of his colleagues and then coming to me. And so as I grew up, I'm, as the wonderful introduction says, now on the editorial board of a Marxist journal. I thought to myself, at some point it would be nice to unite these two things, to bring together a passion for video games and a passion for doing historical materialism. And I think in a way, this is something I've thought about for quite a long time. How do we make sense of these things as a cultural phenomena? And for me, those early memories with floppy disks, I don't know if anybody played video games with floppy disks when they were younger. So I remember having post-it notes littered around the screen with instructions about how to load these games and losing them and forgetting how to do it and having to ask my dad and so on. Games have come a long, long way since then. Now the most popular cultural commodities are video games. They make the most profit. They're consumed by hundreds of millions of people. And so we should have something to say as the left, as Marxists, as critical thinkers about this kind of form. And I want to read a short quote from Stuart Hall, which I frame the book around, which I hope explains the position I'm coming to with this book. Which is that popular culture, Stuart Hall says, is one of the sites where the struggle for and against a culture of the powerful is engaged. It is also the stake to be won or lost in that struggle. It's an arena of consent and resistance. It's partly where hegemony arises, but also where it's secured. And it's not a sphere where socialism, or a socialist culture, already fully formed might just be expressed. But it is one of the places where socialism might be constituted. And that is why popular culture matters. Otherwise, to tell you the truth, I don't give a damn about it. Now, obviously, I do give a bit of a damn about video games, but we can still think about this as a book that is trying to do something more than just talk about video games. And so the roots for this book come from, I was playing one of the Assassin's Creed games. I don't know if people are familiar with these. So the one set in Victorian London, Assassin's Creed Syndicate. And in this game, you meet a virtual Marx as the assassins. And what's quite interesting about this is one of the things that Marx asks the assassins to do, and I'm not sure if this is totally historically accurate, is he asks these two assassins to break into a factory. He says, we need to know about the conditions of work. We want to find out about the horrors of these factories. And so he asks these two assassins to, scale a wall, jump in through a window, set fire to some hay bales, and steal factory records. Now, the reality for Marx is way less exciting than this. He reads factory reports from the British Parliament. He reads kind of long documents about the conditions of factories. But it's a really important moment, I argue, for Marx. This moment of, he spent time writing Capital, and he's now saying that the experiences of workers are an important starting point to us not only understanding capitalism, but going beyond it. And that he places workers' experience at the core of this. And this is a kind of research that I do, inspired by this kind of workers' inquiry method, which is about seeing that if we want to understand work, whether it's Uber drivers today, cleaners in central London, factory workers in the global south, there are already people who really understand this work, people who do it on a day-to-day basis. And that perhaps research can play a role in uncovering those conditions, but also supporting people to organize at the same time. And so seeing Marx in this video game gave me this idea of what would a workers' inquiry in the video games industry look like? How could we peel away those layers behind Assassin's Creed in London, behind these historical figures that you get to play with and so on? And how could you know about how the game was actually made? And I always think video games are an interesting commodity to think about in this way. When you turn on a console, how many kinds of work were needed for that game to come on? How many factory workers, logistics workers, software developers, testers, PR workers? If you could imagine all of those workers behind you as you were playing that game, how many would there be there? And it obscures the processes when we get that final product in lots of ways. And so a couple of years ago, I wrote a paper in about 2015, which was kind of sketching out the kind of overall dynamics of the video games industry. And so I looked at the kind of work that was involved, from the software houses to testing and so on, looked at how games were being made, interviewed a few people, spoke to people I know in the industry, and came to a conclusion which is now totally out of date, but I'm going to give it to you anyway, which was that there are clearly grievances in the video games industry. Many people work incredibly long shifts in software studios, particularly towards the end of a development cycle. There's a prevalence of what's called crunch time. So video games, much like Hollywood films, are very tied to release dates. So you want your game to come out in the holiday season or before a competitor's game or whatever. And in many projects, the kind of failure to manage these things correctly, or to properly plan out time for them or so on, or really to pay enough people to be working on them, means that people then have to make up huge amounts of time working. And one of the people I spoke to said that he went through one of these long periods of crunch time. And at one stage he was working 70, 80, 90-hour weeks, was working weekends, slept in the studio, barely saw his friends or family. And the owner of the studio at the end said, do you know what, we've decided not to make this game. So he poured his life, literally his life, into making this game. And they decided it wouldn't quite make enough money. So it was canned. And when you speak to video game workers in whether in the US or the UK, these kinds of stories are very common. That studios will mobilize the passion that people have to work in the industry, to say these are the kind of jobs, you want to work in this studio, you want to work on this game, this series, but we want the game to be good and that requires you to do this much work. And this in a sense ties in with the second grievance, which is, people might not be surprised to hear, questions of institutional sexism, of the gendering of the workforce, the racializing of the workforce in various ways. And I think this is quite tied to crunch in many ways. That asking workers to take on those incredibly long and intense periods of work makes it very difficult for people with caring responsibilities, with families, to stay in the industry. And so by driving out people without caring responsibilities, you then make it easier to make the workforce crunch. So you end up with a kind of self-reinforcing cycle that genders the workforce. It also keeps it quite young. Even if you're thinking of having a family and so on, lots of people decide to move out of the industry, whether you have somebody else who can help with caring or not. And you get a big churn in the kind of people who are working in the industry. And so at the time in 2015, I said, look, these are two issues that you could really see workers mobilize over in the video games industry. And at the time I said, they're just not there yet. There's no active organizing happening. There are no kind of worker networks springing up, but kind of watch this space. And in one of these nice moments of, I was really pleased to get this wrong, people are now beginning to organize in the video games industry. And this is one of the stories that I tell in the book about the production of video games. And I want to tell a little bit of the story of this organizing, but I also want to say that, in a sense, that kind of resistance in video games has been there since the very beginning. The earliest video games were made by people who should have been helping to plot nuclear missile paths and, kind of horrible military industrial complex type computing problems, and found ways to make video games to have a bit more fun. And so you have this kind of hacker ethos and a kind of resistance against working practices that's there at the beginning of video games. And in one of these lovely moments, while I was writing the book, I was asking my dad about this. And he said, oh, I did that when I was your age. I was meant to be making industrial calendars, and we found a way to make this, it sounds like such an archaic computer now, but to make a Moonlander game. And so they mucked around all day playing Moonlander instead of creating industrial calendars, which sounds like a way less interesting thing to spend your time doing. And so what's been clear from the organizing that's happened now is that there's been lots of resistance below the surface, with people leaving big studios to set up other ones, or leaving the industry altogether, or trying out individual forms of resistance. But just over a year ago, this switched from individual practices to a much more collective effort. So one of the biggest industry conferences, and in a sense, this is a kind of what managers shouldn't do example, is workers wanted to have a discussion about unions in the industry. People might know there was a strike of voice actors a couple of years ago. So there have been some kind of peripherally attached labor struggles. And video games developers wanted to have a discussion about unions. And rather than let it happen, people tried to suppress the discussion completely, which caused a massive scandal. And this launched an international network called Game Workers Unite. So in trying to suppress that one discussion, the managers involved managed to spread the idea of unions across the whole world. And also, people who'd never heard of unions or didn't know unions were something they could do, knew this was something their managers were not a fan of, and therefore it looked quite attractive to them. So you have this kind of strange thing that happened in the video games industry, where many people have no experience of unions, but want to get involved in unions in some way. And so a friend of mine who'd been at the conference said, this sounds right up your street. It's about video games and they want to organize. Maybe you should reach out and talk to them. And in the book, I document this story of meeting Game Workers Unite in the UK when they were one person, and documenting their growth when they went from one person to three to 20 to 100. And then at the end of last year, they were the first group to form a union out of this network. So they now have an official trade union in the UK. And what I think is quite remarkable about it is this is a group of workers that we would traditionally think, from the labor movement, these are going to be really difficult to organize people. They're comparatively well paid. They don't have kind of traditions of organizing in the sector and so on. But what's been quite remarkable is the kind of things that people have said to us in the meetings, the kind of stories that we've heard. And the first that I want to say is the first meeting we ever held, someone came up to us and said, look, I'm really keen to join. I really want a union. I'm just a bit worried about having to go and tell my manager that I've joined the union. And we kind of took a minute and said, what do you mean tell your manager? He said, well, I'm doing it, and then I have to go and tell my manager, don't I? I have to kind of publicly declare in my workplace. And we said, not at all. Where have you got that from? They said, oh, that's just how unions work, isn't it? And in that, I think there's a really interesting point. A misunderstanding of some of the protections we can have when we organize, but that this person was prepared to do it despite that. They were so keen on organizing in their sector that they would be the first person to go and declare to their manager, I'm starting to unionize. The other thing that I think is quite interesting is not having those traditions of union membership has meant that people have had to learn about what a union is, what a union does, but the conclusions they've come to are very different to many mainstream or traditional trade unions. So there's an idea that decisions should be democratic, there should be mass participation from the membership, that they should talk through ideas about who can be in the union, who can be outside of it. They should have control over their own finances, their own strategy, and so on. And so what this meant in the UK was not joining a mainstream union, not joining one of the larger kind of conglomerate unions, but joining a small trade union called the IWGB, who are famous in the UK for organizing migrant cleaners, Uber drivers, bicycle couriers, food delivery workers, foster carers, a kind of whole range of different kinds of precarious workers. And so are now part of that discussion about what it means to organize in sectors that people haven't organized in before. And I think in many ways, this kind of story of unionization in the video games industry allows us to have another way to think through what politics in the video games industry could look like. Because, the politics at present of the video games industry, the kind of video games that we get to play, the kind of cultures that we play within, leaves a lot lacking. And I think somebody asked me when I was talking about this the other day, they said, why do you think there is such a toxic culture in the video games industry? And I think there's a whole number of different factors that we can look at that have led to this kind of toxicity in many video games cultures. The lack of diversity within people who make games, the specific ways that games have been marketed. Think, for example, about why Game Boy is called Game Boy. Why was it marketed to a certain segment? That once you start marketing things that way, you start to get more of a certain demographic playing video games. And then think about what it means to set up a community and to not curate it in any way, to let anything go. And I think when you think about how all those different factors come together, it can be very difficult to think about a path out of that. What does it mean to make an intervention that could start to solve some of those issues? And that's why I think people beginning to organize in the video games industry gives us a sense of what workers' power could mean for reshaping the video games industry. For people having a more of a say over the kinds of games they produce, the relationships they have with different communities and so on, starts to peel back and unveil some of those factors that are most present in video games. And so the argument that I make throughout the book is a twofold one, really. The first is, why should the left and why should Marxists be interested in video games? And I think this is quite straightforward. I mean, the Stuart Hall quote sums this up for me. Video games are clearly a place where ideology is created, reinforced, where ideas are had. And frankly, it's one that the left has lost in many ways, hasn't been able to intervene in. And there's, I was going to say a fantastic piece, but it's by Steve Bannon, so I'm not going to say it's fantastic. But fantastic in terms of him unveiling some of the things that have happened in the video games community, is he put out a strategy piece saying why the alt-right should organize amongst the video games community, saying that it was ripe for organizing, that these were communities you could reach with these ideas, they were susceptible, and that they could then help to become the embryo of an alt-right that could move away from online and into the streets, which I think, particularly if we're speaking in the US, we can see the effects of that in very, very concrete ways. So why should Marxists be interested? Well, because other people are, and we should be contesting those ideas. I also think we should be interested because in many ways video games have become emblematic of contemporary capitalism. They unite the shifts of production to the global south, the hardware that's required for us to play, the logistics networks that bring consoles, controllers, video game discs and all manner of things into the global north, with those more kinds of immaterial production required to make them. Software development at the higher end, the testing that's required for many games, and to see that looking at the workplace starts to give us a sense of, the role of capital within this, who's making profits from these things, what are the kind of interests involved. But I also think that video games, in a sense, I'm a big fan of sci-fi as well as video games. That might not be surprising. But these are also places where we can imagine alternatives. These are spaces where we can think through alternative futures, we can experiment. And much like activists in the past used theater, the newspaper, mass television and film and so on, we can also bring ideas about alternative ways of living and alternative futures to the medium of video games, of which there are a number of fantastic examples. But then finally, why should people who like video games be interested in Marxism? Well, first, it helps you to understand the Assassin's Creed storyline a bit better. That's a good start. But secondly, the critique that we can bring to video games, and I think this is a really important point, is not one of saying these games should be censored. Is not saying that any video game with violence in it is bad, but that a positive critique of video games can help to broaden out the kind of games we play, the kind of roles we can play within them, and can contest some of the kind of worst cultural tropes of the industry. But by thinking about the people who actually make those video games, we can see how those critiques could actually enter into the material world. That these games are made by people. People make choices about the kinds of things to put into their games. And Marxism can give us a way to think about how work becomes embedded in the things that we play. And I also think that the better online culture could be conceived of in this way too. That the organizing of the video games industry provides another contest of ideas that can be thrown into the current mix of online culture. If people see that the video games that they enjoy playing are made by unionized labor, we can make an argument about unionization much more broadly. And I think what's been interesting about this is, if you've followed the unionization of journalists in the games media, this has been incredibly quick and incredibly successful. And of course then means they cover unionization much more positively. So when you read stories about unionization in games, they're usually overwhelmingly positive. Like, yes, you should be doing this. Yes, this is really good. And it shows that these are not another group of unorganizable workers, but just a yet to be organized group of workers. And if the people making your video games can get organized, why can't you in whatever job you're doing when you're waiting to get home to play the next video game? And so what I want to end on is again going back to Assassin's Creed. Is at the end of that mission, the two assassins are directed a very simple instruction, and I think it's one that we should follow too, which is you should follow Marx. Thank you very much. Okay, we have plenty of time now for questions, comments. Thank you.
That was fantastic. I really loved what you said. Okay, so you're suggesting that maybe having unions in the games industry might help to lessen some of the cultural issues, like some of the really awful things that we're seeing with the people who make them. Has that been shown in any other industries where there's cultures of toxicity, and then unionizing has helped make them more inclusive and less awful? I don't know if that's a good way to put it.
No, that's a great way to put it. Any other questions, comments? Yeah, here and here.
Can you tell us more about how employers reacted when game designers started to organize? And also, you kind of portrayed it like all the game designers have similar working conditions. Maybe you can tell us about the diversity of working conditions.
So reference basic political messages within video games. How is that prefaced? I can understand why Steve Bannon would be the person who'd come up with the idea of this being something they can access, because the progress to it, right? personality is something that's easy to build into video games because it's already kind of like part of the implicit conflict built into it, versus even games which are trying to make alt-right ideas like Far Cry 5, where you're basically killing cultists. They wind up using an underlying theme of, well, the explanation actually for drug dealers. How does that really factor in the idea of this being, of allowing executives to make a decision where a more left ideal is something that can be included in games?
Right, thank you. Yep.
So I program for a living, and my opinion of programming and in particular games is that it can be very hard in the sense that there's a lot of time that needs to go into it. You're dependent on play testing with other people a lot of the time, and the skills, even if you like have the skills, it can be hard, but like acquiring the skills and the technology needed to produce video games can be laborious and expensive, extremely expensive. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how that fits in, I guess, to your perspective of video games through, I guess, the lens of Marx.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take you, and then I'll come back to you.
What are the concerns of like accessibility in? He's briefly touched on the huge barrier to entry there is in the game design industry, but even once he's broken in, their crunch time and stuff sounds like it's really hard on people with depression and chronic illness and all of those things. Like, what are the concerns there, and how can we improve upon that?
I just wanted to ask, I'm a member of the local branch of the Industrial Workers of the World Union, perhaps not dissimilar to, or certainly similar goals to what you talked about, the IWGB. I wanted to ask what video game workers and software, I guess, software workers in general in the U.S., what do they need most? What help can we offer them most effectively?
Thank you. So I guess the first question to answer about could unions make it better? I mean, I think in a sense, I'm always careful with questions like this to say some kinds of unions could make this better. If they're taking on a broader set of questions around politics at work and so on. And I want to tell one story to explain this. There's an activist who's been involved in the union in the UK, and they went for a new job. They got this job, and a fan went through their Twitter and found that they'd said the word feminism, and then complained to the company and said, "This is not what I expect from my games," and the company sacked the worker because they just didn't want the controversy. They just, it was just not something they wanted. And so I think when we see examples of things like this happening, that company is not going to intervene around behavior around the games that are being played. And so I think if that worker had been hired, and if that worker was then able to make arguments about what kind of culture the company was creating, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that workers' power can help to shape a better culture. A union on its own won't do that. And I think what's interesting is in many of the games with particularly toxic cultures, there are workers who are coming forward to organize, who said this is one of the things they want to do something about. They want to fight, sexism within their workplace, but then they also want the company to take responsibility for what it's creating. Now, this is certainly not to say that will solve these problems, because I think the question of Steve Bannon and so on and alt-right organizers is, a kind of whole nother contest to be had. But I think it begins to reshape those cultures, if that makes sense. And I think in any workplace where workers are organized, they feel more able to challenge these things. Whether we're teachers or academics or we're working in public services or so on, it makes it easier for us to challenge these things. In terms of what employers think of unionization, this is actually a really interesting one. The video games industry is skewed between very, very large studios, the kinds of studios that churn out, football franchises, kind of yearly franchises, that make an incredible amount of money, have a very concentrated kind of publishing to studio relationship, a centralization of capital through these, and they're obviously not pro-union. They're quite happy with the situation as it is. But many people who burn out of the kind of AAA large studios go on to form studios themselves. So they say, we can do it better this time. You know, we can set up a smaller studio where we treat people fairly. And lots of these studio heads have come forward to say, we support unionization. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic. And I think we should revisit whether they still support it once unions have been established. Because I think it's one thing to say, I support my workers organizing. It's another thing when they say, you need to pay us more, you need to give us more control over the workflow and so on. But for now, it's a fairly ripe terrain for organizing on, because the people who run these studios have felt these conditions quite sharply. But it also means that conditions can vary massively across the industry. There are a whole number of studios in the UK that don't crunch. They refuse to use overtime. And they show that it is possible to do these things. The difficulty is, it's only possible if you pay more people over a longer period of time, so it's more expensive. So it's a choice that managers have to make. In terms of the politics of games, I think this is a really interesting question, because most video games are shaped around individual agency. And so there's a question of, you know, if we want to make a game that has radical participatory politics at the core of it, mostly it would then have to be seen through the prism of one person's agency. And I always think about this with Civilization, which is my favorite game. You know, if you were to be able to actually introduce a more radical political system, not to pick communism and have like +2 production and better tanks or whatever, is you would essentially not be allowed to play anymore. Like, you would no longer get to make those decisions. It would become radically democratized. And that would be a terrible game to play, because you would basically just be watching your virtual citizens do their own thing with no interaction. But I think what I was talking about with political games is how we can see the interactivity as a way to talk about politics, and a way to introduce people to ideas. And so one of my favorite political games is quite an unusual one. It was published in the Financial Times, and it's a game about being an Uber driver. And not to kind of spoil the game for you, you should go and play it and so on. But if you play through the game, you basically understand how difficult it is to be an Uber driver, because it's impossible to make any money. And so we can think about, I guess what I'm saying is there are like big P political games, like Far Cry talking about cults or so on. And then there are political games that bring a political theme through them, which I think are quite different in the kinds of things that we're talking about. But how does that help us challenge the alt-right? I mean, I think the difficulty here is that many of the games where these things have come into being are online games, where actually the emergence of gameplay doesn't have to go in one direction or other, but it's been shaped by people who have tried to develop that kind of culture. And so the argument I make in the book is it's not good enough for the left to say, well, video games are really complicated and they're full of like nasty things happening, we're just going to leave them. Is say actually we need to make an intervention into them. In terms of the kind of workers who are being organized, they are skilled workers. Many of them have, you know, developed skills, paid for them through university courses. And so in a sense, you know, they're a relatively well-off section of the workforce. Most of them are paid much more than the other members in our union. And that throws up a huge number of obstacles to people engaging in the industry. But one of the things we have in the UK, which would be similar here in the US, is very large companies of video games testers who are paid at minimum wage. They're often, we've seen some contracts where people are told you're not allowed to talk to the games designers. You know, these are like a different class of workers, you don't talk to them. And so I think one of the things we need to do is to start opening up those divisions within studios. And to think about different paths in for people in the video games industry. I think one of the mistakes that's happened recently is the huge explosion in game design courses, which are promising people careers in video games, which most of them aren't going to get. So they're going through like 3-4 year courses with the promise of this at the end, and there isn't a studio that can support a huge number of additional workers. And so then it's very easy for employers to mobilize the passion of these workers and to get them to take conditions that are way lower than what they should be doing. which I guess feeds into the accessibility question, is for me, crunch is one of the major barriers for people working in the industry. It kind of relies on a very particular kind of worker who's able to go through those kinds of processes, who can offload caring responsibilities onto other people. And so that's the question that the union in the UK is raising, that these things are not simply a question of unpaid overtime, but they're also about control over work. And that to be able to open up to a more diverse games industry, you need to be able to contest why games are being managed in this way. And so to wage that as a kind of a struggle for the union, not just over pay, but over like who we hire, how we hire, what we do with people when they're hired. And then in terms of what we can do to support tech workers, I think it's a great question to ask, and I wish more people were asking it. In the UK, the labour movement's been very slow to do anything around this. In the US, the AFL-CIO did put an open letter out welcoming game workers into the labour movement and so on. But what we've learned in the UK from meeting with the video game workers, with spending time with them, is what they need is they need people they can ask questions about organising to. They need the basic, why do you collect email addresses? Why do you follow up with people? What is a union branch? What does a president do? Like the ABCs of organising, which for so many people have been lost. And it's not a surprise because, why would you know what a union is if you've never seen a picket line, you've never met anyone in a union? There's kind of no surprise that these things are missing. So what is needed is people just to say, how can I help? We can sit down and have a coffee and talk about some of these things. And what I think most people would find is you'll then learn a huge amount from these video game workers about what organizing looks like today. And we could definitely do with more organized tech workers, whether in the video games industry or more broadly. Okay, we have time for some more questions.
I have one that's more specific around game theory and game design, and the ideology of achievement and progress around more linear paths in games. What can you kind of comment on in regards to that? Is that totally irrelevant in a Marxist context, or is that the future of games or not?
Thank you.
A lot of the discussions are probably from the north. I'm wondering about game workers in global south, especially thinking of, I remember back in the day there was this kind of sweatshop where people would be rising 24 hours a day, get something to the company would sell to a gamer in the global north. And I'm wondering if this is something that there's some organizing about.
Do you know of any game studios that are co-ops? And if you do, what are they and how do they function? And if not, do you think a game studio could function as a co-op?
Thanks. You mentioned workers' inquiry. I wonder if you could give us an example of how your research helped the workers in that instance.
What kind of tools would be available, or is there any thought towards the ideas that the games industry is starting to use non-employees and contractors for creation of video game assets rather than full employees?
So we kind of touched on the fact that the video game industry has traditionally kind of excluded women and had issues with feminism and all of that. Why should those of us who have been excluded from those sorts of things really care that much about the plight of an industry that doesn't include us in the first place, doesn't, really care about women and people of color and women of color and being represented in games or any of that. I don't know, I kind of sat here going
Any other comments, questions? Okay. So the first one on kind of game theory. So I wrote a book about call centers a few years ago, and so I have a kind of interest in call centers, I guess you could say. and particularly around the use of gamification in call centers. So when I worked in a call center, there would be a lot of, if you make 2 more sales, you get a prize, you rise on the leaderboard, all these kinds of things. And so I think gamification is something that's kind of bled out of the video games industry and affects more and more parts of our lives. But I think gamification is a really odd concept in lots of ways, because lots of us like to gamify parts of our lives. We find if I do, I write another chapter of the book and then I'm going to do something nice at the end of it, or, if I go out for a run today, I'll reward myself with something else, or, whatever it is. But at the same time, it can be mobilized from above very, very powerfully to make us work harder and harder. So there was a horrible story that came out recently of the Amazon warehouses. You can now play a game while you're stacking shelves because they thought it would help decrease turnover. And some of the workers are quite ambivalent about it. They're like, it makes it less banal working in the warehouse. But at the same time, it's like a horrible thing to play a game while you're stacking shelves. And so I think it's a kind of interesting thing that management is able to kind of use against us in lots of ways. But at the same time, how many of you have played video games where you've done a job in that game and you've completed repetitive tasks and you've leveled them up? There's a kind of odd moment where loads of the popular games are things like farming simulators or trucking simulators, where we go from our banal job to come home to play a game that's about doing work is a kind of strange moment. But I think what it speaks to a lot of the time is it's very hard for many of us to find achievements through our own work. We're not recognized for the things we do at work. We're not rewarded for the things we do. And so I guess one of the arguments I've made elsewhere is we should think about gamification from below. So we should think about what it would mean for us to gamify our work in ways that are resisting and destructive maybe, that are more fun than just getting 10 minutes off the phone or a voucher at the end of your shift or whatever. Because we can make those into collective practices that are enjoyable and not just another point or whatever. So the focus on the global north is mainly because one of the big stories in this is about the organizing in the UK. The gold farming sweatshops. So people might not know this, but Steve Bannon, one of his companies was paying people in the global south to do repetitive tasks to make gold on World of Warcraft to then sell to players in the global north. This is how he developed that understanding of why intervening within the video games industry was a good idea, because he had that practical experience of working with these communities. In lots of places, and this comes to the subcontracting question too, so the most profitable video game multimedia commodity of all time is Grand Theft Auto 5. It was made in Edinburgh, in Scotland, but it also wasn't made in Edinburgh. It was made in Edinburgh. It was made in studios all over the world, subcontracted all over the world. No one produces Xbox cases in Edinburgh. I can guarantee that. No one produced all of the art assets there. And so this is what I mean about how video games can help us to trace global supply chains in a way that is quite remarkable. You can kind of see how production has changed in contemporary society. And in particular, there are now huge centers of video games development in the global south. Chennai in India, for example, has hundreds of thousands of people producing assets for video games. When I was in India last year, one of the interesting things that happened was meeting some of these young workers who were organizing. They were radicalized around the Tamil movement, around the ethnic cleansing of the Tamils, and they started organizing in unions, and they want to make links with the global north. So they were introduce us to video game workers elsewhere. And so you start to see moments of solidarity emerging across these kind of international borders. In terms of co-ops, there are lots of video game co-ops, lots of small co-ops. I think one of the problems with them, in principle, they're a wonderful idea. One of the problems in the video games industry is one of having your games discovered. So if you set up a small co-op and you make a fantastic game, you then have to enter into a market that is dominated by incredibly wealthy publishers that will advertise everywhere. And so finding those small niche games becomes incredibly difficult. And often what people find, and you hear these stories of small indie developers, they end up having to self-exploit massively to compete. These kind of stories of like sleeping in their car to go to a convention to publicize a game that then no one hears about it anyway. And so I think whilst we should encourage them at every opportunity, we also need to see that organizing within the big studios is another important part of it. In terms of what Workers' Inquiry has done to help, I think what I've tried to do, and it goes a bit to the question about what can we do to help, is just to spend time with these workers. So to come along to their meetings and say, what do you need? Maybe we can explain some of how union works, we can talk these things through. What we've started to do more recently is collectively mapping out the video games industry in the UK. So running training sessions, getting big bits of paper, drawing out where people know people and so on, is bringing some of the tools of research to these workers and saying, you know the answers to these things already, we just need to think about how we do them. And I think this is more, this is what academics should be doing. We should be going out into the world. If we study work, we should be going to the people who do that work. We should be talking to them, and we shouldn't just be extracting things. We should be saying, what can I do to help you? What can the resources of the university do to help? And so it's a continuing process, and the story of this is in the book. But over the last year, they've gone from one person to a union. So I'm hoping the next year is going to be even more exciting in what happens next. And part of that is saying Marxism can give you some tools to help organize. And I think that tool is Workers' Inquiry. The final question, so why should you care? I think this is a difficult one. I think if people feel like they've been excluded from an industry, why should you care about it? But I think the stories that I've heard from workers in the video games industry is that there are loads of people who have also said, I feel excluded and I'm inside the industry. I've been kicked out of a job. I haven't been allowed to make decisions. I've had to find jobs elsewhere. There are many, many women, people of color, a huge diversity of experiences that are suppressed within the industry. And so we should care about this, not because if you care about a particular video game or not, but we should care about the conditions under which people work. And the reality is that today, most people who play video games are women, identify as women. That is the reality today. And so it's come a long, long way since me playing floppy disks as a teenage boy, thinking that you needed that skill and technical ability to do things. Video games are mass culture now, in a way that has shifted in a long way. And we should want that to be an inclusive culture that everybody can participate in. But also, we should engage in it because we want a better society. Just like Stuart Hall said, otherwise I couldn't really care less about video games. Okay, we've got time for one or two more questions and then we'll wrap up.
You talked a little bit about gamification and how it can induce self-destructive behaviors. I just want to know, how do you think that we can, reconstruct gamification in a way that it's more enriching to our everyday lives?
Thank you. Over here. Yeah.
So my question is with, if you think of video games as a finished product with tons of labor behind it to localize around the world, and you can come with a product like, let's say, Fallout 76, and you feel like, okay, this doesn't seem like a $60 game because there's so many things wrong with it, and you realize we can just constantly update it over and over again to probably make it something that's possibly worse than now. What would be your critique of looking at sort of how those instances in the games will just seem complete, but they really fix them using online interfaces?
Right, thank you. And then we had another question here, and then here. Yeah.
What can young people entering the industry do?
How do you address your management not dealing with symptoms but the actual problem? Like in the video game industry, you're talking about, well, they deal with crunch time, you never see your kids. What if how do you stop management from saying, well, we'll give you free daycare?
Thank you. Okay, so there's a couple there. So I'm going to deal with yours first. So I think this is the question of what are people asking for when they organize? And this is what I think is so exciting about the organizing that's happening. I'm in an academic workers union as well, and we argue for 1.2% pay increase on a year, and like, please don't cut our pensions. And we argue over quite specific economistic things. And recently we've like lost on those quite a lot. It's not the kind of biggest vision. What's interesting when these workers are meeting is they're talking about how do we stop crunch, is about how do we have more control over the work. You know, how we deal with questions of inclusion and diversity is about who is managing these games. And so I think what we have to encourage is that a union can do more than bargain on an annual or every 2-year basis, and that people should have genuine control, not taking daycare and saying, you know, that's just going to solve everything. And I think there's a long road towards doing that. You know, in the UK, it's taken a year to start a union. That's actually quite quick in lots of ways. You know, many of these workers didn't know what a union was a year ago. And I think this is something we need to be encouraging with solidarity from elsewhere, to say you can do better than just getting daycare. You know, you can reshape the industry. In terms of gamification, I mean, I guess the point I'm trying to make about gamification is it's a concept that can be used in multiple ways. So we can have we have to read in what are the intentions behind it. And what I mean by this is most of the gamification we see in the video games industry today is about monetization. It's about feedback loops to keep you playing a game. And I think this is where we see the imperatives of capital within the video games industry. That it's not enough to have a game that you can play once for 2 hours and never come back to. You need to have a game that locks you coming back in and in and in with feedback loops, with being able to buy things and so on. And so when we think about what restructuring gamification looks like, we need to open up those questions more broadly. You know, why are we even thinking about adding in those game-like elements from elsewhere? Which I think goes to your question. It's really interesting. In New York, someone said exactly the same thing. You know, what's happened with Fallout 76? And if people are familiar with some of these massive titles that have come out recently, my favorite example is Anthem, which is like borderline unplayable, just because it's not complete, is when you then get somebody like Jason Schreier from Kotaku, who went through and did a whole series of interviews, is you find out it's because the management was just completely, had like no idea what they were doing. So some of these games, I mean, Anthem was in pre-production for 7 years, and apparently they only really started making the game in the last 6 to 9 months, because management, the decisions from management kept changing what they wanted the game to be. And so this is where we see like an age-old problem of management, is how do managers manage people who they don't really understand what their work is about? You know, how do you manage someone who writes code that you basically think is a kind of magic? You know, you don't know how long it takes, you don't know what's involved in it. And this goes to your question, is that's why you should contest these things in the video games industry. Because the people who make games know loads more about how games should be made, or how they could be made, than somebody who flies in from a publisher to say, scrap the entire storyline 9 months before launch and redo the entire thing. And so I think this has become one of the solutions to crunch from a kind of management perspective, is we'll just keep people working after the launch date. You know, we'll put something half baked out and we'll hope it gets to a better state. But what it, to me, as a labor theorist, is just such a clear evidence of a management failure. You know, they have failed to manage that product. And then I'm leaving your question to last because it's what I'm going to finish on, is if you're a young person and want to get into the video games industry or in the video games industry, I think there's a really simple what can you do, which is you start to organize. You know, get in touch with Game Workers Unite, send them an email, connect with other people in other studios in other cities, but realize that it's not you on your own that has to do this. And that's been the most remarkable thing about this experience with these workers, is seeing a group of workers who are finding their own way to do things. Is you can learn things from other people, but ultimately how the video games industry becomes organized will come from workers like you in the industry deciding what it takes for you to reshape the industry. And that is something that both people who enjoy video games and Marxists should be very keen to encourage. Thank you very much. Okay, so I hear the bar is open. There are some of my books to buy if you're interested, and I'm very happy to talk to anyone at the end as well.